He'd stopped believing in miracles long before the war began. But that night, someone called his name, through smoke, through chaos, and it sounded like Padre Pio. Before he ever wore the uniform, John Miller was a simple man from Kansas, a man who prayed once, but stopped when prayers went unanswered. His childhood was marked by Sundays in the small-town church, where his mother would kneel with fervor, hands clasped together, whispering prayers that seemed to reach heaven. He watched, young and innocent, believing that every word carried divine weight. But life has a cruel way of testing faith. When his father fell gravely ill, John prayed every night. He prayed until his words became mechanical, empty, and when his father passed, something inside him died too. The church became a distant place, an echo of unfulfilled promises. Years later, when the draft letter arrived, he didn't think about God. He thought about duty, about survival, about coming home. His mother embraced him at the farewell, placing a small crucifix in his trembling hands. "Take this with you," she whispered, her eyes filled with tears. "He is always with you, even when you don't feel it." John kept the crucifix in his pocket, more out of love for his mother than faith. The battlefield tore his faith apart piece by piece. Each friend lost, each prayer unheard. War wasn't like the newspapers said. There was no glory there, only blood and mud, screams echoing in the darkness and silences that weighed more than any explosion. He saw young men who still had dreams and families waiting, consumed by the fire of violence. He saw motionless bodies where there once was laughter. And with each death, each moment of despair, the distance between him and God grew like an unbridgeable chasm. If you're listening to this story, perhaps you're facing your own battle. If it touched your heart, consider subscribing to this channel. We share stories of faith that transform lives. One night after days of intense combat, John found himself alone in a destroyed trench. The sound of explosions still echoed in the distance, but there, in that moment, all he felt was a profound emptiness. His hands trembled not just from cold, but from fear. The fear of never seeing another dawn, of never embracing his mother again, of dying there, forgotten by God and men. He pulled the crucifix from his pocket, now stained with mud and blood, and for the first time in years, he tried to pray, not with elaborate words or memorized liturgies, but with the raw honesty of a man on the edge of the abyss. "If you're there, show me something, anything." The silence that followed was deafening. He closed his eyes, expecting nothing, believing in nothing. His heart beat hard, irregular, like a war drum inside his chest. And then, through the smoke that enveloped the devastated field, he saw a figure walking toward him. The movement was calm, fearless, completely out of place in that scene of destruction. At first, John thought it was a hallucination. The days without sleep, the hunger, the trauma. But the figure kept approaching, and the closer it came, the more real it became. The stranger wore a simple habit, worn by time, but his eyes carried a light that John couldn't explain. It wasn't the light of explosions or projectiles. It was something deeper, more ancient, something that seemed to pierce not just the darkness of the night, but the darkness of the soul. The man stopped before him, and without saying a word, placed his hand on his shoulder. The touch was real, firm, warm, and then, with a voice that sounded like a whisper and at the same time like distant thunder, he said, "Not yet, my son." John felt something break inside him, not from pain, but from relief, as if all the walls he had built around his heart crumbled at once. He wanted to speak, wanted to ask who this man was, but the words wouldn't come. And before he could comprehend what was happening, the figure began to move away, disappearing into the same smoke from which it had emerged. The sound of battle returned, violent and chaotic, but something had changed. John touched the shoulder where the hand had rested. He could still feel the warmth, the certainty that he wasn't alone. When dawn finally came, he was found unconscious by his unit. They took him to the field hospital, where doctors examined him urgently. There were shrapnel marks all over his uniform, holes torn in the fabric, but when they opened his clothing, they found only superficial scratches. One of the doctors, a middle-aged man with eyes tired from so much death, shook his head in disbelief. "This is impossible," he muttered, holding a piece of shrapnel that had been extracted from the uniform. "This should have pierced your heart, but there's no serious injury. It's as if something or someone protected you." John was silent, processing the words. He put his hand in his pocket, searching for the crucifix his mother had given him. But along with it, he found something that hadn't been there before, a small medal worn by time, with the image of a saint he didn't recognize. The face was gentle but firm, the eyes deep and full of compassion. He turned the medal over and read the inscription, "Saint Pio of Pietrelcina." His hands trembled. He hadn't placed that medal there. He hadn't found it on the battlefield. Somehow, inexplicably, it was with him. In the days that followed, John couldn't stop thinking about the encounter. He asked other soldiers if they had seen the man in the brown habit walking through the field, but no one had seen anything. Some looked at him with pity, thinking that the trauma of war was taking its toll. But John knew what he had seen, he knew what he had felt, and for the first time since his father's death, he began to pray again, not out of obligation, not out of desperation, but out of gratitude. If this story is touching you, leave a like and share it with someone who needs to remember that we are never alone, even in the most difficult battles. When the war finally ended and John returned home, he was no longer the same man who had left. His mother saw it in the first instant. In his eyes there was something different, a peace she didn't expect to find in someone who had been through hell. He told her about the night on the battlefield, about the stranger who saved his life, about the mysterious medal. She listened in silence, tears streaming down her face, and when he finished, she simply said, "He heard my prayers. I never stopped praying for you, son. Not for a single day." But John knew his journey wasn't over. There was a question burning inside him, a need to understand what had happened, who that saint on the medal was. He spent months researching, reading about Padre Pio, about his stigmata, his miracles, his ability to bilocate, to be in two places at the same time. The stories were extraordinary. Soldiers who claimed to have seen him on the battlefield during World War II, protecting them, guiding them to safety. People around the world who received his visit in moments of extreme need, even when he was physically thousands of miles away. And then John made a decision. He sold everything he had and bought a ticket to Italy. He needed to go to San Giovanni Rotondo, the place where Padre Pio had lived and served. He needed to see with his own eyes, feel the presence that had saved him. The journey was long and difficult, but each mile traveled seemed to bring him closer to a truth he still couldn't name. When he finally arrived at the small church in southern Italy, it was a quiet afternoon. Sunlight filtered through the colored stained glass windows, creating patterns of color on the ancient stone floor. There were few faithful there, some kneeling in silent prayer, others lighting candles. John walked slowly down the aisle, his steps echoing softly, and then he saw it, a portrait of Padre Pio on the side wall. His heart stopped for an instant. They were the same eyes. The same eyes that had looked at him through the smoke and chaos, the same eyes that carried that inexplicable light. His legs weakened, and he fell to his knees right there, in the middle of the church. Tears came without warning, releasing years of pain, of doubt, of fear. He cried for his father, for his friends lost in war, for all the times he felt abandoned by God. And he also cried from gratitude, from relief, from understanding, because now he understood. He had never been alone. Even in the darkest moments, even when he thought God wasn't listening, there was a presence watching over him, guiding him, protecting him. He stayed there for hours, praying, talking to God as he never had before, not with memorized words or ready formulas, but with an open heart, vulnerable, honest. And for the first time since childhood, he felt something he had forgotten how to recognize. Peace. A deep, unshakable peace that didn't depend on external circumstances, but came from a place beyond human understanding. That night, John decided to stay in San Giovanni Rotondo for a few weeks. He wanted to immerse himself in that sacred place, meet the people who had lived with Padre Pio, hear their stories, better understand the man who had saved his life. He found shelter in a small guest house run by an elderly lady named Maria, who had personally known Padre Pio for years. Maria had kind eyes and hands marked by hard work, but her voice was soft as a lullaby when she spoke about the saint. "He was different from anyone I've ever met," she told John while serving hot coffee on a cold morning. "Not because he performed miracles, but because he truly saw people. When you looked into his eyes, you had the feeling he could see your entire soul, all the wounds, all the fears, all the hidden beauty, and he didn't judge, he just loved." She told stories that John had never read in any book. She spoke about how Padre Pio spent hours and hours in the confessional, sometimes more than 15 hours a day, listening to the pains and sins of thousands of people, how he bled from his wounds every day, enduring unimaginable pain but never complained, how his only concern was always to bring souls closer to God, no matter the personal cost. "He used to say that suffering isn't a punishment," Maria continued, her eyes distant as if reliving precious memories. "It's a participation in Christ's suffering. It's a form of love. When we embrace our cross, no matter how heavy it is, we unite with him in a way that words cannot describe." John absorbed every word like a thirsty man drinking fresh water. For the first time, he began to understand that his own pain, his father's death, the horrors of war, the years of doubt and loneliness, hadn't been in vain. All of it had shaped him, broken him, and rebuilt him into something new, something closer to God, even though he didn't realize it at the time. During his stay, John began attending daily Mass at the church. He observed the pilgrims who came from all corners of the world, each carrying their own stories of suffering and hope. There were mothers praying for sick children, men seeking direction amid life's confusion, young people looking for purpose, elderly giving thanks for a lifetime of received graces. And in all of them, John saw a reflection of himself, seekers, broken, but still hopeful. One morning, while walking through the convent gardens, John met a man named Giuseppe, an Italian veteran who had also survived the war. Giuseppe had a deep scar that cut across his face from his left eye to his chin, a permanent reminder of a grenade that had exploded too close. But his eyes shone with a joy that seemed impossible for someone who had been through so much. "You saw him too, didn't you?" Giuseppe asked suddenly, studying John's face carefully. It wasn't really a question, but a statement. John was silent for a moment, surprised. "How do you know?" Giuseppe smiled, touching the scar on his face. "Because I saw him too, at Monte Cassino, when all was lost and I was prepared to die. He appeared out of nowhere, told me to go left instead of right. I obeyed without thinking. 30 seconds later, a bomb exploded exactly where I would have been if I had gone right. My comrades, they weren't so lucky." The two men stood in silence, united by an experience few could understand. Giuseppe finally continued, "I spent years wondering why I was spared, why I deserved to live when better men than me died, and then I realized it wasn't about deserving, it was about purpose. God kept me alive because there was still work to do, love to share, lives to touch. The same goes for you, friend." Those words echoed in John's mind for days. Purpose. He had survived for a reason, not by chance, not by luck, but because there was something he still needed to do in this world. The question was, what? The answer began to reveal itself slowly and naturally. John started helping at the church, assisting elderly people up the steps, translating for American tourists visiting the sanctuary, sharing his own story with those who seemed to need to hear it. He discovered there was power in his testimony. Not because he was special or holy, but because it was real. He had been at rock bottom, had lost his faith, had faced death. And even so, God hadn't abandoned him. One afternoon, a young American mother approached him in tears. She held a photo of her son, a soldier who had recently died in combat. "I can't understand," she sobbed. "Why did God allow this? He was so young, had so much ahead of him. Where was God when my son needed him?" John felt a deep pain in his chest, remembering his own journey of unanswered questions. He gently held the woman's hands and looked into her eyes full of agony. "I don't have all the answers," he said honestly. "I can't explain why good people suffer, why young people die, why God allows so much pain. But I can tell you this, God was there with your son. He's always with those who suffer, and your son isn't lost. He's in the Father's arms, at peace, waiting for the day when you'll meet again." He then told his story about the night on the battlefield, about Padre Pio, about the mysterious medal. And as he spoke, he saw the woman's expression slowly change. The pain didn't disappear, but something else joined it, a spark of hope, a thread of consolation, an anchor she could hold on to. "Thank you," she whispered when he finished. "Thank you for reminding me that he wasn't alone." It was in that moment that John understood his purpose. He hadn't been saved to live an ordinary life and forget the miracle he had received. He had been saved to be a witness, to be a light for others walking in darkness, to be living proof that God still acts in the world, even when all seems lost. When it finally came time to return to the United States, John was no longer the confused and broken man who had arrived in Italy. He carried with him not just Padre Pio's medal, but a clear mission, to live in a way that honored the miracle he had received. Not through grand gestures or grandiose proclamations, but through the simplicity of daily love, patience with the difficult, compassion for the lost. Padre Pio once said, "Prayer is the oxygen of the soul." That night on the battlefield, John learned to breathe again. He discovered that faith isn't the absence of doubt or pain, but the choice to trust even when everything seems lost. It's believing there's a greater purpose, even when we can't see it. It's knowing that in the end, we're not walking alone through this broken world. John Miller never became a saint or a priest. He returned to Kansas, married a local teacher named Sarah, had 3 children, and lived a life many would consider ordinary. But those who knew him closely knew there was something extraordinary about him, a peace that transcended circumstances, a faith that had been forged in the fire of doubt and emerged stronger. He worked as a carpenter, building houses with his own hands, but his real work was building bridges. Bridges between people and God, between despair and hope, between darkness and light. His home was always open to veterans struggling with trauma, to young people questioning their faith, to anyone who needed an attentive ear and a compassionate heart. Every night, before sleeping, he would hold Padre Pio's medal and pray, not just for himself, but for all those who were fighting their own invisible battles. For those who had lost hope, for those who could no longer believe, for those who felt God had forgotten them. And in his final days, when his body finally succumbed to the weight of years, he called his children and grandchildren close to his bed. With a weak but firm voice, he told his story one last time, about the night that changed everything, about the saint who saved his life, about God's love that never gives up. "Keep this," he said, placing Padre Pio's medal in his eldest grandson's hand. "And remember, no matter how dark the night, no matter how impossible the situation seems, God is there. He never abandons us. Sometimes he whispers, sometimes he shouts, but he's always speaking. We just need to learn to listen." If this story touched you, share it with someone who's facing their own battle, whether physical, emotional, or spiritual. And remember, even in war, even in chaos, even in the deepest darkness, God still speaks. Sometimes through extraordinary miracles, sometimes through small signs, but always through a love that never gives up on us. Subscribe to this channel for more stories of faith and miracles that remind us we are not alone. Leave your comment sharing how faith has sustained you in difficult times. And may the peace of Padre Pio, the peace that surpasses all understanding, be with you today and always.